Donald J. Trump has weighed in on our election here in California. Well, a specific race in California. Dave, did you read about this?
I did, and I am devastated for. Imagine being just like the biggest toady of this vile man for what, like 5 years, give or take. And
you've been carrying water for this like Manhattan dumbass for how many years, like publicly?
All of the years.
Yeah. And at the end of all of it, our dear friend, Sheriff Scott Jones, Flo's yoga buddy, has not gotten the nod from Donald J. Trump. In fact, it has gone to who? Kevin Kiley?
Yeah.
His opponent in the race.
Devastating.
I wonder how he's doing.
Can you imagine that? Like, I mean, honestly, like, I don't really feel bad for him no matter what, but like, that's tough. Like, that's got to be like having your hero come out and like burn you like that.
Having your hero burn. Yeah, I mean, he's rough, been like, he's been, platforming on making sure that wall gets built for all of the years. And like, when even the Donald doesn't want you.
It's all falling apart for them. Yeah, he's doing the Snoopy walk around his neighborhood, with the sad Christmas time. Yeah.
Yeah, it's rough. I mean, I feel bad for like that. I feel like I'm trying to think of like what the equivalent would be for me if I was running a race. And I think it would be like if Vin Diesel went on Instagram and was like, I hope Skylar loses that race. I would like, I don't know if I could ever recover as my greatest hero.
I love that Vin Diesel. I love it.
Yeah.
I really like that Vin Diesel is like plugged into Sacramento local elections.
If Dwayne The Rock Johnson didn't
Dream World.
Yeah.
Right. If Jason Statham did not vote for me and recommended that other people did not vote for me, I don't know. I don't know if I could recover.
That's it.
I would honestly I would change my name and move somewhere where
Skylar just becomes the local Boo Radley.
I don't know. I'd have to do some real serious thinking, and I imagine that that our favorite sheriff is probably I imagine that he seems like the kind of guy to often like do a lot of self-reflection. He's probably just doing extra self-reflection in his meditation, his after dinner meditation that he normally seems to like he must engage in
he probably
to maintain his demeanor.
He got some like really cool like journal prompts from his life coach, and he's like working through that,
like what makes you happy. It's like imprisoning people, looking like a thumb.
Sheriff, if you need to spend an extra few minutes in Shavasana today, we will understand.
Like truly though.
Yeah, he's definitely not like under a bridge right now hissing at passersby. He's definitely processing this.
I want
healthily.
An illustration of the country's worst sheriff, one of the country's worst sheriffs, hissing under like 160 as like passersby.
Children scream and run away.
Yeah, just like well, he's like
had
eating
it all.
He's eating like a big old like bucket of Piggly Wiggly fries.
Piggly Wiggly,
and he's
fries.
got like Budweiser. And every time someone goes by, he hisses.
Well, Sheriff Jones, you have my endorsement, and this episode's for you.
Oh, amen.
All right.
Voices, the things they said. Voices, some from those dead. All the voices heard. Voices, things we say. voices. They're in your head. All the voices heard.
Hello, everyone. You have Kempa.
And you have Skylar.
Also, you have Shannon.
And Katie.
Yes, Councilmember Valenzuela. So glad to have you today. I'm super excited for our conversation. Just real quick, I'm going to tell folks, Flo is not here. She's running the Measure U committee as we record. We were listening to her. We've missed her so badly in the minutes before this episode. But a lot of budgeting things happening right now. It makes total sense that Flo and the rest of the Measure U committee would be busy with that. But we get to have Councilmember Katie Valenzuela of District 4 here in Sacramento.
And her staff. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. And her all-star staffer.
We will recognize all of the District 4 staff here.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Shout out to the rest of the crew too.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to have you on today, Katie. We wanted to hear from you about a recent trip that you took to Cuba. It obviously riled up some of the more conservative, landlordy types in our region. But I thought it would be real fun to have you on and talk about sort of what this trip was, kind of what you learned there, and just kind of give folks sort of a view into what Cuba is like, because I know so few Americans have actually been there. Just real quick, I don't know if folks noticed, but as we record today, I think just a couple hours before recording, President Biden actually lifted some of the restrictions that President Donald Trump had put on sending remittances back to their families in Cuba, on travel, and on just general interactions between our two countries. So it's a very small positive step, but there's so much more that could be done. So
yeah, I have a question about that real quick, because I didn't get a chance to read that whole article. Did you, if you did he didn't bring it all the way back to where Obama had it before Trump changed it back, right? But he did some stuff, but not all the Obama stuff. Is that right?
That is my understanding. Yes, there is still, you still cannot do tourist travel. You can do group to group type travel. Shannon, what are you laughing at?
I just really like
Shannon. That wasn't that funny.
I just really like the summary of what the article was about by Skylar. Some of the, so he got rid of some of the Trump stuff and brought back some of the Obama stuff, but not all of the Obama stuff.
Which,
it's good.
I mean, basically, that's true.
I haven't been on the show in a while.
Yeah, that's an accurate summary of that article.
Yeah, I'm tickled. I'm glad to be here. I'll stop.
We have Skylar on this show for his incisive analysis, so I welcome that.
Yeah, exactly.
But yes, there have been some things lifted. There is still no technical tourist travel. It has to be sort of group to group educational type things, which I believe. And then there's some people who have historically been able to travel there for many reasons, political reasons, which is why Katie is, legally allowed to go. Sports reasons, if you're like a sports player, you can go. And historically, I believe academics can for various reasons from the US. This is kind of neither here nor there. Katie, can you tell us, first of all, for all the Steve Maviglios out there, what was the purpose of this trip to Cuba?
Yes, thank you. And hi, Steve. Glad you're listening. I went with an organization called Building Relations with Cuban Labor. They are part of a national network of solidarity organizations supporting Cuba. This one in particular is run by Bill Camp, who is our former head of the Central Labor Council in Sacramento, and a woman named Nancy Amata, who is a longtime labor attorney, bargainer, just hardcore couple of folks. And they've got this ragtag board and they go down, and they've been going down for over a decade. There's about a dozen reasons actually you can go to Cuba. We went under support for Cuban people, which is a thing you can check that essentially means you're going down to just help the Cubans. We brought a bunch of medicine and books
Trump
and things
added that reason, actually, I think. Yeah.
So we were able to go down under that, but we were really there for May Day, which is their annual celebration of the workers. It's essentially a worker party. There's a big parade where all the workers participate in the parade, and basically all the dignitaries and electeds just like watch and cheer them on for a whole morning. And then there's a big party at an ocean spot that we got to go to on a beach, which was pretty cool. Lots of beer and all sorts of wonderful things.
That sounds amazing. I am
so
jealous
amazing.
that you got to do that.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing. I mean, we did a lot of other stuff there too, which we could talk about, but I think like that was the primary reason we were there, was to build with the unions. And a big part of Bill Camp's philosophy and the philosophy of the organization is that when you build unions, you build not just democracy, but just you build communities. And so he's a big fan of that. He actually has some Hondurans up right now for that same purpose in Sacramento that we met with last night. So he's a big believer that labor organizing just helps people build political power and get things done. So that's why we were down there, and it was pretty incredible.
That is incredible. And labor organizing is, sort of the strategically and on principle, it is a global struggle, right? It is a global thing that folks are trying to pull together laborers so that, they are not exploited in every sort of corner of our world. So that's really cool and meaningful that something like this would be happening in Cuba, and that Americans who represent labor and the interests of labor would come out and participate actively in something like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are people from, I'm pretty sure, everywhere in the world. Like I even saw North Koreans there. I saw literally you were seeing these flags and you'd kind of look at it and be like, what's that flag? And I take a photo of it so I could like Google it later. And I'm like, oh, it was that country. I mean, it was an incredible, Cuba wants to work with everybody and, really believes in, live and let live and solidarity of the workers specifically. It was incredible to be there and just kind of, I found myself just taking a lot of videos actually just to try to like soak in the moment of watching 6 million workers walk by while all of these like dignitaries just applauded them for hours. It was incredible.
That is incredible. How much where were you staying in Havana?
Yeah, we spent the first half of the trip in Havana, and then some of us elected to stay for an extended trip, which was an additional 5 or 6 days where we went around the country to, in this case, we were staying kind of central Cuba. Cuba is actually a lot bigger, at least than I mentally imagined. So we went south to like Bay of Pigs, Cienfuegos, Trinidad. We were in Santa Clara, which is the home of the Che Guevara monument and memorial, and then came back in the whole, we were hours away from Havana, and when they showed us on the map, I'm like, oh, we're not even like this far outside of it on this big country map. It's huge.
Bay of Pigs, is that like Playa Girón?
Yes.
Oh, so cool. This is, folks, famously where the CIA backed a lot of CIA folks plus some CIA backed Batista supporters came back and tried to win Cuba once more for this former fascist regime, and lost very badly to the Cuban people.
Because little did they know that Fidel was staying very nearby with a whole lot of people with him, and they waged this epic battle. And you go to the museum and see, because a lot of what the museum is doing is documenting some of the paraphernalia they collected, why they know that it was the Americans behind it. They had a bunch of American-made weapons and uniforms, and they captured a bunch of these folks, and they basically said like, yeah. So it was it was pretty cool to see it from that perspective. Just the other side of what that experience was for them. They're very proud of that whole area and just the way the people fought back when the time came.
Yeah. Okay, so you got to spend some, I don't even know where to begin with this whole,
I know there's so much to say.
Well, first of all, I guess talk to us a little bit about this sort of some of these labor conversations that you are part of, as well as the sort of international conference.
Yeah, we met with union leaders from the national union in Havana. And also when we traveled to Cienfuegos, we met with some union leaders there. And the unions really are the backbone. They represent everybody. And there's a lot of women in the leadership actually that I got to meet. It was funny because I asked them, like, how is the gender parity in your elected offices? And they're like, well, we're more than 50%. So of course we have half the seats at least, and they just looked at me like, duh. And I'm like, we could learn so much from you. But yeah, they are doing fantastic work. And it's funny because some of the questions we were asking, because I was with a lot of like teachers and, bakers union folks and different people, and they were asking about strikes and stuff. And they were like, no, there's no strikes here. Like, the laws protect the workers. And when there's a conflict, there's a process and the process is resolved. And like, the workers have plenty of options to pursue their rights and to hear grievances and to seek resolution. So it's like not even heard of to them that there would be such a need for something like a strike. It was almost like, no, what are you talking about? Of course, there's no strikes. We met the folks from the hotel unions and some of the leaders from that, and they are just so frustrated because I think they've built a really great infrastructure, but what they're missing is the income. What they're missing is the tourism. What they're missing is the trade. And you can talk to a worker, a maid in a hotel. You can talk to whoever you want to talk to, and they're going to say the same thing. Like, the U.S. needs to end the blockade. That's what they call it there. We call it the embargo. They call it the blockade. They need to end the blockade because, how else are we going to grow and thrive as a community if we're continue to be stamped on? And there's some really interesting graphic designs that were shown during the conference to kind of illustrate how they feel about the embargo, which are pretty strong. There's some really strong things that they feel, obviously, because like during the pandemic, for instance, we talked to a lot of medical staff. The U.S. wouldn't let them buy ventilators. They had to create their own ventilators to keep people alive when COVID-19 hit the island because they couldn't access ventilators. When they developed their own vaccines, and I say vaccine plural, doesn't need to be refrigerated, as effective as Moderna or Pfizer. It's really revolutionary. They had to get the unions in the United States to rally to send them syringes so that they could get everybody vaccinated. It's just incredibly frustrating to them. But what they have is an incredible infrastructure where people feel a lot of ownership and they're very present. When we met with them, there was always, we met in the Cienfuegos, there was 50 people in that room, from the different unions, and they were there to hear what their leaders had to say. The communication system is just incredible.
Yeah. Can I hop in and give a little context for folks
Sure.
who might not know, who are listeners or viewers? The U.S. and even in Cuba's statement today about some of the lifts that Biden has put on the former policy on Americans in Cuba, historically, ever since Fidel Castro wrested power from the fascist Batista in 1959, the U.S. has led a devastating, and that's a term they use in Cuba even today, a devastating blockade economic embargo that has really harmed the people of Cuba and forced so many to live in destitution. And this is historically how the imperial governments of our world tend to try and fight and push back against any form of socialism in this world. What they do is they shut them off economically and from the rest of the world and try and just strangle them tighter and tighter until the people's material conditions deteriorate, right? If we had open trading with Cuba today, if we had open tourism, and if our government had, over the last 63 years actively just had an amicable relationship with Cuba, their material conditions would be so much better. So this is a policy choice by the U.S. that has harmed regular working people in a country like Cuba. And we've done this in this country to countries all over the world.
Yeah.
Not only that,
and then we use them as examples of why socialism never works.
Yeah.
Right. Precisely.
Yeah.
And
I think, And I think when Raul came into power, and I've been reading a lot from like journalists who've lived there, and there's a lot that's not perfect about Cuba, and a lot of Cubans, including the politicians and union leaders, will say, like, we've work to do. It's only, and I remember one person telling me, well, it's only been 60 years since the revolution, so like, give us time. We got to keep figuring this out. But when Raul took power, one of the things he did was really open up the media, right, and social media,
This is
and
Fidel's
really gave
brother,
Fidel's
younger
brother
brother.
When he became ill and stepped away from the presidency, his brother came in and assumed the presidency, and he opened up a lot of media and communications, and it's making people very anxious, because I think the generation of Cubans who was there for the revolution obviously gets it. They understood what it was like during Batista's time. They know how much has changed since that time has passed. They don't take it for granted, and they talk a lot about what they don't take for granted. But they're watching the younger generation who wasn't around when that happened get on Facebook, see propaganda from the United States, see what's going on, see things that other people have in other countries, and say, "Hey, wait a minute, why don't I have that?" And blame the government. And I actually heard that from some folks that are like, "No, the government's incompetent. That's why we don't have things." And I'm like, there's no government in the world that'd be able to walk around a blockade this stringent. I mean, this isn't just, and just to make sure people understand what we're talking about, I mean, this isn't just, you can't, travel restrictions, trade restrictions. This is not just doing business with the United States. This is anybody who does business with Cuba that then wants to do business with the United States gets penalized for this. I mean, they have cast the net so wide. And what Obama did was start to roll that back and try to, in his words, normalize relations. And when Trump came in, not only did he undo what Obama did, he put over 200 additional rules on top of the sanctions that were already there. And that's the world that they're living in. So when you walk around Cuba today, I mean, there are shortages on shelves. People were eager for our toiletries. Like, I was encouraged when I went to bring full size like shampoos and like hair stuff. And they're like, leave it, like ask the hotel staff or the tour guides if they want it. And they were thrilled, because this was something that was hard for them to get. And so the younger generation that's being exposed to this media and seeing what other people have and seeing this propaganda are saying, well, why don't we have that? And I remember reading this quote from Raul at one point during his presidency, when he's like, well, you don't have to worry about housing. You don't have to worry about healthcare. You don't have to worry about your education. You're guaranteed a pension, all of these things. Like, yes, your wages are low and it's hard to get goods, but this is the price we're paying for living, for having these things.
Healthcare is free there.
Yeah. And he was trying to make this case to them about, like, yes, I know you don't have, and it would be easier if the United States would relax if we changed our ways, but there comes with this cost. And it just is, it's a battle that's ongoing, and that a lot of people, especially in the middle up, like older range, and even some of the young people, are starting to get really anxious about.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of Americans don't understand either the reasoning for, why life is hard there. I told some family members the other day that, the literacy is 100% there. And they looked at me with blank looks on their face. And they're like, well, why don't we know this? And I said, because of American propaganda. Like,
why would you know this? That was one of the first things they did after the revolution, was send out teachers. The counter-revolutionaries, the Batista supporters, we actually passed a few monuments, and I asked what they were, and they said those are monuments to some of the teachers that they killed in the early days, because they went out into the rural areas to teach everybody how to read. I mean, this was a movement that came from those communities, right? And they were teaching them to read, making sure they had housing, they were building properties, they were reallocating properties that had been left behind to people who worked there, descendants of slaves who worked those properties. It was just incredible, but nobody would know that. And then they really hit this wall after the missile crisis, and after, Kennedy came through and just cut everything off at the knees.
Yeah. No, I also wanted to briefly mention, you were talking about how even countries that want to trade with Cuba are penalized for doing that. A big reason for that is that the U.S. has historically listed Cuba as supporting of terrorism, which is absolutely...
That was the Trump administration's final parting blow to Cuba.
Yeah, and it's absolute bullshit. And not only that, if anyone wants to look up Cuban Flight 455 on October 6, 1976, this is a devastating day, a day that Cubans all know, when a CIA-backed group of terrorists who are supporters of Batista blew up a plane, a commercial flight, and killed 73 people on board. Like, which country here actually has supported terrorism in this situation? And the more you do read about this, the more you actually see kind of it's a lot of like projection, like the messaging the US uses against Cuba, they're actually accusing them of doing things that our government themselves have done over the last few decades.
Oh, 100%. Well, and I think it's important to name not just Bautista as a fascist, which he was, but the role of the mafia in Cuba before the revolution. They owned Havana. And there's so many photos and so many books and so much documentation about this, that they were openly, this was America's playground in large part because the mafia was there and they were attracting, musicians and actors and just all sorts of folks to come. But Bill Camp actually has this fascinating story where I guess a cousin of his or a family member of his was in Cuba trying to start a chicken farm. And they said, oh, he went to the government to apply for a permit. And they were like, oh, no, you've got to go talk to them. And they basically sent him to the mafia, who said, here's what you have to pay to get us to allow you to do this chicken farm in Cuba. So this was not just fascism, although that was egregious enough. This was also just rampant exploitation of the Cuban people and the Cuban government to allow for this playground for America criminal syndicates to operate. So this was part of it, is like you had folks leave Cuba who were property owners, who were the affluent, who benefited from the system, who were largely dictating the politics here now, right? And then you also had these very affluent, connected people who also had connections to this mafia, who were very frustrated that they lost their money source, their source of income. So it was so some people are just like, well, it doesn't make sense. Because for me, it didn't make sense either. I'm like, that doesn't feel like enough, because we've had all these incidents with other countries and we haven't shut them down this hard. But when you look at the totality of incidents and what was going on at the time that Fidel had led that revolution with, Che and all of those folks, that kind of puts it more into context of an economic driver. They're mad that they lost their money.
Yeah. And if folks want to learn more about that story, highly recommended season 2 of Blowback, the podcast. Incredible. It's so well done. And it tells its story very, very well over the course of 7-8 episodes. Okay. I've been to Cuba. I went in 2006. I was like a senior in college, technically not allowed to go. But I really kind of wanted to see what the fuss was about. And I was there for Fidel's 80th birthday, and they had a huge party on the Malecon, which is the main thoroughfare, right, that goes all along the coast in Havana. Can you talk a little bit about the people of Cuba, what they're like? Because that to me was probably, not just these cars that seem to last forever and all these the colors and stuff. That to me was the thing that I'll never forget.
The people of Cuba, I mean, so many have left so for different reasons, right? Sometimes they had to because they couldn't get things they needed. Sometimes they didn't want to be in Cuba. The people who were there believe in this vision. The people who were there are incredibly kind, incredibly generous. I posted about a knee injury I took on a hike outside of Trinidad. And when we were trying to get back up, which was hard work because my knee was actively bleeding and in a lot of pain, these guys came down and I knew the guide had called. And so I just assumed, oh, these are folks from the clinic. They weren't. They were restaurant workers who heard that somebody was hurt on the trail and came down with the stretcher, basically offering to carry me back up this very steep trail to the road. And I was so stunned it was such a perfect example of what it's like to be a Cuban, these are folks who look out for each other. They know each other. They're very friendly. The crime rate is incredibly low. It's petty crime, maybe, but you see hitchhikers everywhere because cars are really expensive. And they're like, no, people
don't hitchhiked there. Yeah.
They don't get kidnapped here. They don't she's like, no, if people go missing, it's because they fell into the swamp and didn't get out, they're it's not, that people don't get murdered here. It's just very, it's just the solidarity and the word that they use a lot is love. They use love a lot. And mi pueblo, right? They talk a lot about my people. And it's just, you feel it everywhere you go, even in small ways that people help each other out. And even in big ways, with the incident with me on this hike. And so, I mean, they're just incredible people. Like, we actually stayed with these grandparents in Cienfuegos because our hotel had canceled. It ended up being better because then we were just renting these rooms from these abuelos in Cienfuegos, and they were just telling their stories of driving the country, and they'd had their car for 48 years, which I'm like, what American has done that other than like the lowriders and some select groups? But they love their country and they love their neighbors, and they're genuinely interested in helping each other, and it's just incredible. And of course, there's exceptions to every rule in every place, but I mean, largely in Cuba, I just saw an incredibly resilient, amazing community.
Yeah. So I actually, I'm probably like most Americans, I don't know much about Cuba and its geography beyond Havana, Playa Hidon, and like Guantanamo, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, what is Cienfuegos? Kind of how big or small is that town or city, and kind of what was the whole deal there?
Cienfuegos is south of Havana, kind of like if you went straight down, you'd hit Bay of Pigs. And if you go a little bit to the east, you'd be in Cienfuegos. It's another bay area. It's where a lot of ships used to come in. A lot of these towns in the south were very big tourist destinations because they'd get like the European and the big cruises. They'd go down the United States and end up at the south part of Cuba. And those were these towns that sprung up for that. And they're just beautiful places, really. And we actually drove by because it's on the coast. You have a lot of towns that have been destroyed by hurricanes. And guess what they do in crisis in Cuba? They commandeer the hotels, get everybody into hotels, and they give them all the materials to rebuild their homes.
Unheard of here.
And so we were finding these beautiful homes that were like colorful and like really nice. And you could see everybody was just kind of lounging around and hanging out on the weekend. And I'm like, this is amazing. But yeah, Cienfuegos is south. And we went there to visit some of the trade unions and to visit some of the schools. They had some really amazing residential art schools for children there that we went to tour. But yeah, I mean, the people there, just like anywhere else, like I think of the teachers were my age, right? And I mean, they're there for a reason. I mean, they're there because they believe that art is a right and that they want to teach these kids how to do what they do well. And they're sending them out to the rural communities to perform. And that's like part of their mission, is to make sure every Cuban has exposure or can practice music and art in their communities. And it's just,
yeah.
I mean, I feel like I keep going on these vignettes, but it's hard to really like encapsulate some of these like areas. But yeah, Cienfuegos is south. So we went like Bay of Pigs and then Cienfuegos. And then we went kind of further east to Trinidad. And the whole time, I mean, we were kind of working around the central mountain range. We didn't even get to like the eastern mountain range, which is where Fidel was from and where he's buried. We didn't get anywhere to like the west side. We were really just in the central part of Cuba, and just
it's
hours
a very
and hours
long
of driving.
Island.
Yeah, very long island, a lot bigger than folks would think.
Mm-hmm. And also for the lefties who like to, kind of squabble with other lefty ideologies, Cienfuegos is named after a man named Camilo Cienfuegos. He is famously an anarchist. And even though he did not agree politically with Fidel or Che on a number of things, he is a deeply, deeply respected person in that country.
Absolutely.
Where else do we go with this? Shannon, Skylar?
I haven't been. I don't know.
Okay. I've got more questions. I'll ask a couple more. So some people got a little fussy back here in Sacramento. I did, in fact, see our dear friend, America's landlord, Steve Maviglio.
The Washington Generals of Sacramento politics.
Yes, the Washington General. Skylar's saying that because Steve commented on a post of Katie's regarding her trip to Cuba, and he was subsequently just dunked on left and right by like dozens of people, and it was just a joyful thing to watch. So Steve, look forward to seeing more of you. And hey man, unblock me on Twitter. I want to see it on there too. But he came out saying like, well, why didn't Councilmember Valenzuela go to Cap where she could actually help the people of Sacramento? Cap being where business leaders and city officials in Sacramento once a year, led by like the Metro Chamber, will fly out to Washington, D.C. and try and build relationships out there and try and get, I don't know, money and resources from the folks in D.C. apparently.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, that happens every year. And so there was a part of me that was weighing the fact that, you know, I hope Bill Camp lives forever, but he probably won't. And I knew this was probably, I wanted to go with him to Cuba, and I knew this might be one of my last chances. But also, I mean, I always knew Cap to Cap was there. There was also this interesting thing where Cap to Cap this year, and it is organized by the Metro Chamber, got scheduled when one of the House, I think the Senate was in recess, or one of like either the Senate or the House was in recess. And so I'm like, okay, so we're not even going to get to mingle with the staff of like one of the whole houses. And honestly, a lot of my colleagues were going, but it was a good thing I didn't go, because coming back from Cap to Cap, and it's not really been widely reported, which is kind of amazing to me, like 50 people got COVID, including 3 of my colleagues, like real bad, like really, really bad. Like they are down for the count. And it was, and I'm like, well, gosh, I mean, Cuba, people wear masks everywhere. They've got their own vaccines. They trust their healthcare professionals. So they're largely pretty healthy. They actually have one of the longest life expectancies in the world. In Cuba, you should have come to Cuba.
Yeah.
because COVID might not have been the best time.
Free healthcare too. You know, my, you know, knowing nothing of this, because I haven't heard about this, and I have my finger on the pulse pretty well in Sacramento. I would think that this would be a PR nightmare for the folks at the Metro Chamber and some other of the folks that went out there, that they would be so kind of laissez-faire, to use a American economic term, in their approach to this Cap to Cap trip, that would result in this effectively becoming a super spreader event. So, report on it, someone. T. Cliff, you heard it here first.
Lots of people got sick. And thankfully everybody's okay, right? Because you don't want anybody to get seriously ill, and that's good. And everybody was vaccinated and boosted. But yeah, it's kind of just interesting, because I think the part I found most interesting was the fact that he kept calling my trip a special interest junket. And I just think it's so fascinating when people call labor special interests, because I'm like, no, they're governed by the workers, and the workers are what make the economy run. And like, that's not. Plus, I pay for this myself, for anybody who's asking. I did not use my council funds for this. So it's just, I'm like, I essentially took a vacation to go help and learn about a country that is really close to us, and I think has a lot to teach us. So, I mean, when is that? It's interesting that that's considered a bad thing by anybody.
It's another instance of the lady doth protest too much. It's like Steve he's projecting again, right? It's like come on, man, like that all you represent are special interests, like, you know.
Well, and I love that I was you know, meeting with these important people and learning all these great lessons, and, you know, swimming in this beautiful ocean and tasting amazing rum, while Steve was just sitting here just angsting over the fact that I was there. Like,
blood boiling.
When Skylar messaged me, I was like, what? Like I hadn't even checked. I didn't even see it until Skylar messaged me, and I was like, oh my gosh, what is going on with this? So no, I think everybody should try to go. And honestly, I think two things for next steps for me is just, one is that they are planning to organize a May Day trip every year until the embargo is lifted. So there is an opportunity to go, especially for union folks. And if they need financial help, I mean, they're really good at helping figure that out. They're doing similar work with Honduras. And I'll just put a quick sidebar in there. Like, the reason the Honduran labor leaders are up here is because Honduran labor leaders under the previous administration, they have a new president, tended to get murdered a lot, assassinated a lot. So they like it when folks come down from America, because we're big news. And when the news shows up, people are safe, because there's a spotlight now on what's happening. And so there's going to be key moments where Bill will also organize trips to Honduras so that we can help support key organizing moments for the unions down there as well. So I think it's all really important. And I like to think that part of why Biden finally did something today is because there were a lot of us from America down there, and we were sharing on social media and posting and tweeting like this. I don't care what you feel about Cuba. I don't care what they did in the past. There's no justification for what is, as you mentioned, a war on Cuba. There's actually a really great YouTube series that people should watch called War on Cuba that Danny Glover and others produced with Cuban journalists talking
Oliver
about
Stone
what's going
is
on.
the other producer on that.
Oh.
Yeah, it's incredible. And like we learned things that we didn't know, like the Havana syndrome whole thing, it's not real. And like they had American scientists on basically being like, this is not real. So like it really debunks, and it shows, if you go to their website, because they have a web page outside of YouTube, it shows them making ventilators to survive during COVID. It shows what they did and what the healthcare industry did. And I have to say that one thing I really respect not only is that they live in the community, so Cubans really respect their medical professionals, but also they have free health, training for anybody. So you had folks from around the world getting training. They were in front on the May Day parade on purpose. The president made a point of noting that the healthcare workers were out front because what they did during the pandemic, given the embargo, was nothing short of amazing. I really have to respect the respect that they showed to their healthcare workers and what they've been doing down there.
Yeah. And what they've been doing with what little, once again, that they had because of this devastating, violent embargo the U.S. has put on that country. The U.S. and the Trump administration really, when the pandemic hit, started twisting the knife even further at a time when just people needed more and more help, right? And so it really is unconscionable.
If we think we hate Trump, you should talk to a Cuban in Cuba about Trump because their hatred for the Trump administration goes far beyond anything I've heard expressed, because it was so direct and they felt it so viscerally
and it came on the heels of like Obama undoing a bunch of damage. So there were so many businesses that were like, sweet, let's go. Like, we're ready to go. Had a couple of great years, and then they just got whiplash when Trump shut it all back down. I mean, I can't imagine how incredibly frustrating and discouraging that must have been.
Incredibly frustrating. And they feel, this is part of why I saw on the news when I got back last week, national news, they said it was the highest levels of Cuban migration that they had seen for several decades, like 80,000 people have come, in the last year. And it's in large part because of our policies towards them. And I think just the genuine, there's an active effort to maintain. They actually have something called, they say CDR. You see CDR everywhere. It's Commission Defense in the Revolution that they created to kind of help fight back against the counter-revolutionary forces. But now today still exists as these neighborhood, they're helping the mom with the special needs kids, make sure she has the food and the doctor she needs. They're helping just solve community problems when a building has to lock down for quarantine because there's been a COVID exposure. They're bringing produce and goods to them to make sure they're comfortable. These have become the agents of the government in these neighborhoods, and they try so hard to help people feel supported and connected. But you also can't blame a Cuban, especially if you needed something, say you had a rare illness or your child needed something, or you had family that you hadn't seen in years because of the Trump administration's draconian policies. You can't really blame them for trying to get over here by any means possible. And it's just heartbreaking to realize that we are both lamenting this crisis and also actively perpetuating it by not changing these policies.
Trump also, I don't know if I mentioned, he instated a thing that said a remittance being if you're a family member who lives in the US, you send money back to your home country to help support your family back there. He put a cap on family remittances during this pandemic. And he said, you can only send $1,000 per quarter per form every 3 months back there. And again, this is another just really heartless, void of humanity move. Real quick, I just wanted to mention to folks, you mentioned the new president in, where was that, Honduras? Yeah,
in Honduras.
Her name's Xiomara Castro, and her win, she's a very, very exciting leftist, first ever, I believe, woman president there. And she represents sort of a swing away from, I believe within that country, it was a far right regime, but all throughout Latin America, we're seeing neoliberal regimes fall as well in places like Chile. And it's something that is starting to look like what one would call the second sort of pink tide of like social democratic governments rising all throughout Latin America. So this is an exciting time for the left, I think, in the Americas. I know we're in the belly of the beast, and sometimes it can be real demoralizing to see the way that people are treated by our city, state, and national governments. But sometimes when you look out the window, it's like it's kind of nice to see the tide moving a certain way.
Absolutely. But we also have to guard, because part of what the president is doing in Honduras in terms of rolling back the free trade zones, rolling back kind of the blank checks that had been written to businesses to essentially do what they wanted. Some of the stories last night were just incredible. And like, would have never known that was a law that we allowed. She's rolling that back, and she's doing it pretty aggressively. And she's only been in office for 100 days. And I think folks are nervous, folks are excited, and folks are also very cognizant of the need to support, which is why if you're able to think about asking your unions or your employers to help pay you, or if you're able to pay for yourself to go on one of these trips down to Honduras, you could literally be saving lives and actually helping move the needle in Honduras towards a more democratic and just socialist and amazing country that they want to be.
Yeah. Oh my God, this was such a joy talking to you about this. Thank you so much for talking with us about this today.
Always. I have so much more to say. I feel like I keep having these stories pop into my head, and I'm like, no, stop. But if nothing else, I hope folks will watch the War on Cuba videos. They're very quick and easy. They're very good. They're done by journalists in Cuba who are very open about the faults of the government, but also very clearly calling on us to act. You can contact your Congress people to encourage them to sign on to push the Biden administration further. And just, if you can sign up for some of these trips, they're going to be life-changing for you, but they'll do even more for the people that you're visiting who just need that little bit of hope and that infusion of solidarity that, as one person said, you can't buy solidarity, solidarity can't be bought, I think is how they said it at one of the conferences. And it was just amazing.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great call to action. And it's sort of, I think for a lot of us will help pull some of the wool out from our eyes on kind of what we've been told, right? The Columbus moments, as Skylar likes to call it.
Absolutely.
Which, that's so great. We have about 15 minutes left. And I obviously, like what we just talked about, like that to me is like, just, I could go on with you on this forever too, but I actually
have one piece of trivia I want to interject before we move off of Cuba. Did you know that in between the period when Obama opened things up and Trump shut them back down, that Vin Diesel visited Cuba, and they filmed the first scene of, I believe, Fast and Furious 8 is filmed in Cuba. It takes place there. And they would not be allowed to do that today. And I just think that is an important moment in history that I wanted to name before we moved on from the conversation around Cuba.
Still fishing for that Vin Diesel endorsement, huh, Sky?
I can't keep that in the back pocket. Wind up like Sheriff Jones. The campaign starts now.
Just an incredible place, incredible people. And I think that Honduras conversation I didn't expect, but I'm glad we got to have that a little bit today. But I figured since we had you on, we don't have you on too often. But I wanted to, since we had you, I wanted to be able to discuss it's budget season, and there's some things happening in the Sac City budget, which, A of all, that's why Flo's not here right now. But last week, Tuesday, on the 10th of May, City Manager Howard Chan came out kind of with some of his budget recommendations. There's still a month-long process, so things can get hammered out and worked out in certain ways, but a couple things seem to be pretty concerning. One of them being that it kind of looked like, and the Sunrise Sacramento folks caught on to this real fast, it looked like they were trying to make our climate goals look completely batshit unrealistic, and that we have better places to spend our money. They did similar things, and you called this out during that meeting. Howard Chan put up just like a bunch of different arts and community-based development projects that have been greenlit already. Many of them, as you said, had the MOUs underway. And he's like, well, these are a couple of things that I guess hypothetically we could cut. And like, these are the heart and soul of ours, like
including like most
funding.
of the DCR fund, like all of the DCR funding for the mid-year. So all the women and children's funding and all of the outreach funding.
Yeah.
We haven't contracted with this yet, so maybe we can use this money for climate.
Yes. And then on top of that, I believe this budget for next year is set to put the Sacramento police funding at an all-time high of $165.8 million. That is an increase to the police budget.
It's higher than that, Kempa.
Oh, I was reading, this is from a B article from...
That's an older article.
Oh, from
this
last
is
year.
$221 million is what's being proposed for SAC PD.
Okay, so they're adding how much?
Slightly
a little bit. It's just a little.
Just off by 80 million.
That's a deep conversation on how much they're adding, because that gets to why this is a crazy budget year for Sacramento.
Just incredible. And they're ringing the alarms. And I figured after Howard Chan lost his war criminal right-hand man, Conlin, that like maybe he'd go a little easier on this stuff, but he's not. So what we're seeing is City Manager Howard Chan trying to defund investments in our poor communities, investments in our arts, investments in, even things like the community response. Although thankfully, I believe that we'll be getting a good deal more funding this year.
For this year.
Yeah. And then he's trying to put how much more? How much is he trying to raise the police budget?
So by my math, it's 17 million from last year, but there's important changes that I'm saying by my math, because if Sacramento City's budget was opaque before, it got a little bit more intense this year. And I had a moment during the meeting where I was like, wait, where'd this money go? Right. So when you look at the
it's like
budget
a fucking
chart,
shell game that they're trying to do.
It just takes a lot. And I think they're trying to improve it. But then what happened in the process of trying to improve it is it just made it like super confusing, because they did two things at once. One thing was they changed how they reported the money. So when you look at the budget and you go to the department, like I'm looking at the police budget right now, you see department budget summary, and you see a number at the bottom of that top chart that says total. And you're thinking, okay, that's the total budget. Well, there's a line above that says labor and supply offset, and there's parentheses indicating that they're subtracting money away because it's being paid by something else. So until last year, that parentheses next to labor and supply offset included Measure U money. So if you look at the police budget actuals from 2021, it's got, a negative $45 million offset. And they're like, well, that was the Measure U money, because they were counting it as an extra fund. They weren't counting it as general fund dollars. So what they decided to do this year was bring the Measure U funding into the charts, which is actually an improvement, right? Because now instead of just seeing general fund, you see the Measure U money, and now just the labor and supply offset is grant funding, or if they have a fee that pays for something, it's other funds. So it's a much smaller number. But what they also did is they moved the money between Measure U and general fund, because one of the big critiques of Dr. Flo and others is that we were using Measure U money for mostly public safety, and that wasn't what the community voted on. It should have been going to housing, youth, and the things that were promised. So essentially what they said was, okay. And they moved a bunch of money out of Measure U for public safety and gave them more general funds. So the budget didn't change. And then they put more of the youth and arts and homeless response money into Measure U, and then took away their general fund money. So you have now a Measure U report that looks like, only a couple million is going to public safety. And now most of it's going to these community priorities, when they actually didn't. They just moved between general fund and Measure U. And so those are the two things that happened. And what was weird to me about it is that they changed last year's budget. So what would have made sense in the realignment, which I guess we did authorize in the resolution, I found the language, and so it's all there, is that it would have made sense if we did it in this year's document, so everybody could see, here's what the prior Measure U funding was, here's what the new Measure U's funding is, and that's why you're seeing it in this chart. But they actually went back to the 2021, 2022 budget documents and changed everything there. And so this year it's like, oh, didn't you know that happened? And I'm like, where did this money go? So it's pretty confusing to see. So essentially what you have to do if you want to get the total department budget, you have to add up that bottom line that says total to the labor and supply offset. And that's the true department budget, counting all grant funds and all other funds that come in. So
great, glad they cleared that up for us.
I literally have to pull up a separate chart because I made
that, right? Like
I made a chart because I had to have a separate chart to do this.
Charting. You told me that.
I can't track this. So by my math, this year's proposed budget for SAC PD is $228,447,000. If you add up their general fund and with the labor supply offset and everything that's in there. So that is a $17 million increase from last year's adjusted amount. And last year's adjusted amount to the 2020-2021 is about $30 million. So last year's budget adjustment was actually closer to $30 million. And this year's is smaller, but it is still more money.
Howard.
I hope that makes sense because it took me a long time to get it down that short.
It only makes sense because as you're talking, I'm looking at.
And I'm making hand gestures.
Yeah, well, that is incredibly helpful.
Yeah, our YouTubers will understand what happened here.
So they moved the money around in Measure U, and then they changed the way they report the money. I think the first change makes a lot of sense. The second change, it's kind of interesting response to the critique of like, why are you spending so much Measure U money on public safety, to be like, oh, we're not anymore, but we're still giving them the same amount of money. It's not like we cut those budgets. It's that we just move the money around. So this year, it's still a pretty significant increase for police. And ironically, what I found super interesting when I looked at the city manager's budget, so in 2020 and 2021, he had his annual total budget was about $10 million. And this year it's going to be $25 million. And that's a pretty, I'm like,
Howard Chan is building a personal army.
Yeah. So like his department now, because he also has moved things under the city manager. So like affordable housing is under him now, like climate action, some of these things are inclusive economic development, but it is really difficult within that to see and understand how that all parses out and where that money is spent, which is our ongoing critique is how did you spend that money? So the police chief today, for instance, asked me what I would like to know, what questions I had, because tomorrow or today, when you hear this, we're talking about the police budget at 5:00. And I said, well, I'd like to know how you used the $30 million you got last year and what your measure for success was for that money. So that's going to be my primary question, because $30 million is a lot of money. And I want to understand what it was used for. That's a reasonable question to ask as the fiscal steward for your tax dollars, right? So
totally reasonable. I'm also interested to see to what granularity she will be able to say where that 30 million went. SAC PD, and I've talked with the Police Oversight Committee on this. I've talked with Flo at Measure U. They famously do not tell you what money is going where. They give you just like real basic numbers, and it's a problem. And if they want to practice what they're saying about like we're trying to increase transparency at SAC PD, like we need some real oversight on granularity on where our tax dollars are going if it's going to harm our citizens to do X, Y, or Z. Yeah. We need to know. I really think we do.
Well, I was helping one of the commissioners, who's my appointee, Keon, who's now, I think, the chair of the subcommittee and the vice chair of the whole committee, but he serves the subcommittee on the budget. And we were trying for weeks, to get more detailed budget information, because when you see the budget presentation, when you read the budget, there's all these very specific things that they're saying, well, we need, $4 million for this or a couple million for that or whatever. And so we're thinking, okay, somewhere you have a report of using the money for those things was kind of where we started. And so we're like, okay, how much money? What was the total program? What did you achieve? And eventually the response we got back was essentially, because he was at the point where he's like, well, I'm going to submit a public records request because you're not giving me this info. And they said, we do not have to create information that we do not have, was essentially the answer. Yeah. So like when you submit a Public Records Act request, I'm not required to go audit everything and figure out where this money goes. So essentially what they were saying is, we don't have a detailed calculation. And so when I chimed in and said, wait, what? Like you get the most general fund funds out of any department and you don't have an accounting for where that money goes. And they said, well, it's really complicated because it's, some employees do multiple functions and it's hard to
wouldn't understand.
Yeah, I would
and I was
say
like,
that. Like, it's very complicated.
But then I asked them, like, well, then where do these budget requests come from? Because if you can't track, then how do you tell me that you spent this 1 point whatever million on that training program? You said, if you can't tell me how much money you spent on that training program. And it kind of ended in this weird way where we were like, okay, we're just going to have to assume that you don't track this, which I don't care how you feel about departments or what your philosophy is behind public safety, to have any department getting a third of our general fund budget, and it is, I did the numbers because you have to do that. 35% of our general fund is going to this department. I want to understand what that money is used for. I need to be able to, because then in the field, you'll hear police say things like, oh, we don't have the budget for a drug response team, right? And I'm like, well, how do you know you don't have a budget? Like, show me why you don't have a budget, because you're getting more money than you've ever gotten before. Like when people call me and say, well, I called the cops 5 times and nobody ever came. I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense, because if you're getting the highest budget numbers you've ever gotten, then people should be getting responses. So, and I know there's a lot of complexity behind how that happens, but like, these are things that the public is asking me that I'm going to ask the department that we should be able to answer, just as a matter of good governance.
I would like to Chief Lester to be able to answer that, because it feels, from a third party perspective, obviously I have my opinions on police and policing, but it feels like either A, this is a misuse of funds if they're not able to track their funds in any level of granularity, or B, they are lying and just hiding something from us. And I had a C, but I lost it.
Well, I mean, this goes back to like the city would not fulfill its city grants to partners that did not produce metrics to show how they were spending that money, right? So like if City of Refuge, for example, would not provide information about how they are spending their money to serve folks experiencing homelessness, if St. John's Program for Real Change couldn't do this, like the city would say, well, you're not going to get your money. Like, because
we have said that to people before.
Yeah. So why the fuck is it different for police? And we know why it's different for police, but like there is, when it comes to stewarding the resources of the local government, it should not be surprising that you have folks who are asking the tough questions. Yeah. And actually, it's fucking embarrassing that the tough question is, how do you spend your fucking money? Like,
well, and especially when they're getting ready to do a full-scale audit of DCR, Department of Community Response. I mean, we've done full-scale audits of individual grantees before, and they've ended up not getting city funding again in some cases as a result of that. And again, it was incredibly frustrating to have followed these presentations, as Kempa just outlined, basically saying, well, we're just going to have to defund every road maintenance, every Latino. I mean, almost every Latino ask from the mid-year budget was on that list. I don't know if any of you caught that, but I caught that. All of the DCR mid-year programs, all of this stuff, we have to defund all of that to do climate. And then to turn around and say, but they're getting 17 million on top of the 32 million they got last year. And you can't tell me.
You can't tell us where the money's going.
And I'm telling you, so something that's surprising to people, and I'll just say on the show, is I do meet with the Police Officers Association regularly. Don't always agree, but we talk, right? And so he'll always say, I need more officers. And I'll always say, show me the evidence that having more officers will increase safety.
Right.
And when you show me the evidence that something is going to increase safety, by golly, I will do it. I don't care if I don't like the answer. If you show me evidence that something you're trying to do is going to create more safety, I will do it, because I want my community to be safe just like anybody else. But there is no evidence that increasing officers. And in fact, the own charts, so they did it again this year, which I find fascinating, because I did catch Chief Hahn on this last year. They have the chart of officers per 1,000 and they have the chart of crimes per 1,000. And when you put them next to each other, because it's the same 6 cities in both of those charts, there is There are cities with lower police per 1,000 with lower crime. There are cities with higher police per 1,000 with higher crime. So I'm like, help me understand, because I know what the evidence shows, the evidence I've seen shows, which is prevention and housing and economic opportunity that prevents crime. But I'm not seeing why putting $30 million, what did that get us last year? Because we had our gun violence is going through the roof. And I'm not saying that's the police's responsibility. What I'm saying is we're not putting the money towards the things that would keep that stuff from happening. It's not their job to stop that from happening. It's other programs' job.
Yeah. So Katie, I think discussing this budget thing, as we mentioned, there's a few more weeks of this getting worked out. I don't know how set in stone it is today, but I think a good start for listeners who are interested in some community check-in and oversight on this is to attend Tuesday, May 17th City Council meeting at 5 o'clock.
That would be tonight as you're listening to this.
Yes.
And at 2 o'clock, they're talking about youth parks and community enrichment. I don't want to lose that. But yes, at 5 o'clock, they will talk about police and fire.
Okay. And these are important meetings and a really important discussion. There's also we have to actually tell the police department if we're willing to fund their like less than lethal quote unquote stuff and like some of their tanks and things. They are now legally required to ask the community that. So I'll send a link to that survey and say, please cops, don't spend money on that. And I guess that's that with that discussion. I'm just such a joy to have you, Katie, and to discuss not just the budget, but also your Cuba trip.
Yes, I would not be as good as I am without my talented staff, not just Skylar, but Michelle and Michaela and Tamika deserve a shout out as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, really a pleasure to be here and talk with you all. And I hope folks will get involved. The budget should be wrapped by June 14th is the current plan. And so just this goes pretty quickly. But also don't forget the county budget is going to be happening at the same time, and follow people's budget for action alerts, etc.
So much budget.
Budget.
I mean, speaking of the budget, like let's hypothetically say that I have $5 to spend. Now, there's a couple of ways that I can go with it, right? Like one way that I can go with it is I can fork it over to the city, and who knows where it will go. I mean, even where they'll spend it and then they'll give me a 500-page indecipherable document, which ostensibly is to inform me of what has happened with my $5. But Dave, there's got to be a more streamlined way that involves a little more granularity, if you will, with what you would do with that $5. I just can't think of what it might be, and I'm hoping that you can help me out with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think depending on the legislative body, that can be a good place to put it. Were we to have 5 Katies out of 9 people on the dais, that might, be a good idea here. But, another thing you can consider is really investing in something that will help you learn about potentially dangerous tweets regarding, a local bar and leaf blowers, or perhaps, discussions on, myself doing acro yoga with a former police chief. If this is the type of thing that you think really helps bring the discourse really to the next level, I would recommend going to patreon.com/voicesrivercity and putting that $5 down per month and helping us do the work that we do. We love the work that we do. If you love it, we'd really like you to invest in it too. We will be having soon a patron-only meetup. So become a patron today, and then you will be getting the info on that. But beyond that, we've got a store, voicesrivercity.com/shop. We just got a new Shannon, I got to let you know, we just got another order the other day. I just did my delivery finally to Mickey as well. So Mickey Rat, I hope you are wearing the t-shirt, drinking a claw out of that little koozie. And I know you're under the weather right now, as many people are, especially the folks coming from cap to cap. So I hope you feel better. But yeah, you can find me on the socials. I'm Kempa at YOUKNOWKEMPA.
You can find me, as always, at Guillotine for You. That is Guillotine, the number 4, YOU.
I'm at Shan and D Stevens.
And Dr. Flo is at Flojaune, FLOJAUNE. And Katie, should I address you as council member?
We don't need to tell people where to find.
Am I making your job harder here?
Oh, Skylar loves it when people tweet at us. Katie for Council is the personal /campaignish account where I do all fun political things. And then Skylar, I don't remember my official council handle. What's that?
I don't either. I never have to sign in because my phone remembers what my face looks like.
I just searched Councilmember Valenzuela.
There you go.
CMK Valenzuela.
Oh, thank you, Shannon. You're hired.
Correct. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Shannon doing Skylar's job.
I'm looking for some new gigs. So.
Well, that's our show. Once more, Katie, thank you so much for coming on.
Yes.
Just such a cool topic. And I don't know. I guess that's it. Anyone else want to add anything?
I don't even have one thing.
No. Not even one thing.
That's great.
Right.
Tune in next week for Vin Diesel facts with Skylar.
Also, tune in Thursday. We have a special episode. Shannon, Flo, and I will be discussing the local elections. And yeah, actually another reason to become a patron, because we're trying to do more work and we're trying to do our civic duties. So yeah, keep an eye out for that.
Ooh, are you going to talk about campaign donations, Dave, that folks have taken?
Yeah, maybe business interests are putting a lot of money, an unprecedented amount, into a city council race. We might discuss that.
BRC voter guide coming at you Thursday.
Looking forward to it.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.